Welcome back to the channel, guys. Let's get straight into today's story. Whenever the idea of rejoining Europe is floated, it's dressed up as cooperation, stability and economic sense. What's rarely discussed is the other side of that coin. How the EU actually spends money, how weak its controls have been for decades, and why British taxpayers would once again be exposed to a system that has repeatedly failed basic standards of accountability. This isn't anti-trade, it isn't isolationism, it's about evidence. And the evidence shows that the EU's financial architecture has long struggled with waste, mismanagement and outright fraud, problems that don't disappear just because politicians avoid talking about them. Start with the most basic fact. For years, the EU's own auditors refused to sign off its accounts. The European Court of Auditors repeatedly issued adverse opinions, citing errors in spending across agricultural, regional development and cohesion funds. These weren't technical quibbles. There were systematic failures in how money was allocated, tracked and verified. The pattern was consistent. Funds sent from Brussels to member states were often poorly monitored once they left the centre. Complex grant rules created opportunities for abuse. National authorities were responsible for oversight, but incentives were weak and accountability was diluted. When fraud occurred, responsibility was blurred across layers of governance. Agricultural subsidies became a textbook example. The common agricultural policy poured billions into land-based payments, encouraging claims tied to acreage rather than productivity. That structure incentivised creative accounting, false declarations and inflated claims. In multiple countries, investigators uncovered networks exploiting the system, sometimes involving politically connected landowners. Regional development funds followed a similar pattern. Projects were approved on paper, funds released, and results often failed to match the promises. White elephant infrastructure, inflated procurement costs, and shell companies became recurring themes. Again, these weren't isolated incidents, they reflected a system where distance from the taxpayer reduced scrutiny. Now, defenders of the EU argue that fraud exists everywhere, including at national level. Now that's true, but scale and structure matter. The EU's multi-layered system creates gaps where responsibility disappears. Money flows from Brussels to national authorities, then to regional bodies, then to contractors. Each step weakens oversight. Each handover creates opportunity. And when things go wrong, enforcement is slow. The EU did eventually establish an anti-fraud office and later a European Public Prosecutor's Office. But those came decades after the problems were well known. Even now, participation is uneven, powers are limited, and prosecutions remain rare compared to the scale of spending. The system reacts, it does not prevent. Now consider what rejoining would actually mean. Britain wouldn't just be trading with the EU, it would be paid into its budget. Billions would once again leave the UK Treasury, earmarked for EU programmes governed by rules Britain doesn't control. Oversight would be shared, responsibility would be diluted, and British taxpayers would be told to trust a system with a long record of failures. This matters because the UK has historically been a net contributor. That means British money would disproportionately fund EU-wide schemes, including those in countries with weaker enforcement standards. Once again, Britain wouldn't get to opt out of the structure, it would be bound by it. There's also a political reality that rarely gets acknowledged. EU budgets are political documents. Spending priorities are shaped by negotiations, compromises and bloc voting. Funds are often used to maintain internal cohesion, not to maximise value for money. That's why reform has always been so slow. Too many interests benefit from the status quo. When campaigners talk about rejoining, they rarely explain how these problems would be fixed. They speak in slogans about cooperation while ignoring institutional reality. The same structures, the same incentives, the same weaknesses would still exist, and Britain would be back on the hook. And let's be clear, this isn't about Europe as a place or Europeans as people. It's about governance. It's about whether a supranational system has earned the right to handle vast sums of public money. On the evidence, that case is very weak. Contrast this with domestic accountability. When spending fails at national level, voters know where to look. Governments can be voted out, ministers can be questioned, auditors can demand answers. That chain weakens dramatically once money is pulled internationally. Now, that's the core issue. Rejoining doesn't just mean closer ties. It means surrendering control over how taxpayers' money is spent. It means accepting a system where accountability is diffused and reform is glacial. Again, supporters will argue that reforms have been made, that systems have improved. But improvement from a low base doesn't equal robustness. The same error rates continue to appear, the same categories of spending remain vulnerable, and the same political resistance to fundamental reform remains. At a time when British households are under pressure, when public services are stretched, and when trust in institutions is fragile, the idea of sending money back into a system with a track record should alarm anyone who cares about fiscal responsibility. Rejoining Europe isn't just a question of identity or diplomacy. It's a question of whether British taxpayers should once again bankroll a bureaucracy that struggles to prove it can safeguard their money. The EU gravy train didn't disappear, it slowed, it rebranded, it restructured. But I think the underlying problems never went away, and pretending otherwise doesn't make them vanish. Before anyone talks seriously about rejoining, they should answer a simple question. Why should British taxpayers accept financial risk in a system they cannot control? And so far, no one has provided a convincing answer. Thanks for watching, guys. If you want more honest political commentary and don't want to miss what's really happening behind the headlines, hit that subscribe button and drop your thoughts in the comments below.